It's safe to say that the story for this one's pretty straightforward, and it's anything but a tangled web. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and a brand new review series. With the upcoming release of Spider-Man No Way Home, I am going to first discuss every other Spider-Man movie. So that's the Tobey Maguire films, the Andrew Garfield movies, the other two Tom Holland movies, and Into the Spider-Verse. And once I get to my review of No Way Home, I'm going to rank every single Spider-Man movie, which is going to be a lot of fun. So we're kicking things off with the first film adaptation, 2002's Spider-Man. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it and let's talk about Spider-Man. This stars Tobey Maguire as nerdy, shy, and awkward high school student Peter Parker. When bitten by a genetically modified spider, Peter gains spider-like abilities that he eventually must use to fight evil as a superhero after tragedy befalls his family. So before we go any further, I would just like to say, as I do with most of my reviews of older films, this is going to be a spoiler-filled review. So if you haven't seen Spider-Man yet and wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. The first film in Sam Raimi's trilogy is without question one of the most important comic book movies of all time, having redefined the modern superhero genre as well as the summer blockbuster. Now, it's worth noting it's not the very first movie in this trend of newer superhero films, as you did have Blade and X-Men come before it, and those were successful at the box office. But this was a massive sensation. It was the third highest grossing movie of 2002, it was the highest grossing superhero film up until that point, and it was the sixth highest grossing movie ever at the time. And I think what helped is the popularity of Spider-Man, who's probably still one of the most well-known superheroes of all time. In a pre-MCU era where characters like Iron Man, Thor, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and everyone else simply weren't as well known, and comic book movies weren't a guaranteed box office smash hit, it's always worth remembering that everyone knew Spider-Man. That was always the case with this character. So its box office success at a time when superhero movies weren't as popular should come as no surprise. And speaking of the MCU, it should be said that we probably wouldn't have gotten that series if it wasn't for this film's success. Not that it directly led to the MCU getting made or anything. Keep in mind, Iron Man still wouldn't get released for another 6 years, and even then, Marvel didn't have a set overarching plan yet for all these characters. That was still considered more of an experiment slash risk when it was made. But this is the film that, more than the ones that preceded it, proved just how much of a demand there truly was for superhero movies, and proved they can be a box office draw. And it either directly or indirectly led to a lot more of these films getting made. Now, I know it's reached a point where people say they're over the amount of superhero movies that are out there, but this was a film that at the time everyone ran to see, and most people who saw it loved it. And it was revolutionary in its use of special effects, in particular CGI. Again, something that has now been used so much that people are a bit tired of it. But the effects like Spider-Man swinging through the city, done through CGI, was something unheard of until that time. Not that special effects in general weren't unheard of, but the extent the CGI here was used, it was something not seen in a film before it. It was never on this grand of a scale before. Now, granted, since this film, CGI has certainly got a lot better, and so many other films have since used it for things much larger in scope. So for those who go back to watch the film years later, or never grew up with it and then try watching it later on, they're typically left unimpressed with this. And that's caused a general divide over this movie in the past few years, especially with the MCU coming in and changing the game even more for superhero films. You have those who grew up with the movie, like myself, and that audience tends to love it, as well as the next film, even if part of it is the nostalgia speaking. But then those who are a little younger and were mainly exposed to the MCU first, or those who just never watched it at the time and didn't get around to it till years later, tend to really not like this movie. And that audience tends to say that it aged poorly, and there are a few reasons in addition to the CGI that have especially caused that. And while I absolutely love this movie and have a blast with it each and every time, I can see where people are coming from, but we'll get all into that in a little bit. So let's not start there, and let's talk about some positives. For one thing, this is a classic classic take on the hero's journey, and one that I find to be extremely effective. You have Peter, who's a good person, but he's bullied, not confident in himself, and doesn't think he can get the girl of his dreams. He gets bit by the spider, it leads him to getting these powers, it gets to his head briefly, and it causes him to not listen to important advice given to him. And as a result of not listening, he loses the person closest to him, that being Uncle Ben, and it leads him to transforming into a stronger, more confident, all-around better person, to make sure that he doesn't make that same mistake again, all while having to fight someone who also obtains powers and uses them for much more sinister intentions. It's a great, simple, straightforward good versus evil storyline. It's one that, especially by today's standards with the superhero overload, does play into a certain formula and can feel familiar. And again, it's one of those things that will feel by the numbers if you're just getting around to it for the first time much later than its initial release. But even so, I didn't see the way it's presented here to be in a way where it felt like it was going through the motions. Even though this hits familiar beats, I felt like this still did a really great job of pulling at your heartstrings and making it feel earned. Like I think of Peter and Uncle Ben, both in terms of their respective characters and their dynamic with each other. The film spends its first act allowing us to get to know the both of them, getting an understanding of their personalities and how they value one another. And it allows for you to like them and grow attached to them. And when Peter gets bit by the spider, it feels like an earned victory where he begins to get more of the confidence he needs and he can stand up to bullies at school and you're on his side all the way. So it makes things all the more heartbreaking, not just when Uncle Ben dies, but the scene prior where Uncle Ben gives Peter the "with great power comes great responsibility" talk.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
And he throws it back in his face. Because you see how close the two were leading up to that scene, and it makes this feel gut-wrenching with both some phenomenal acting by Tobey Maguire and especially Cliff Robertson, who, by the way, I didn't realize was in the movie for as long as he was. Because considering in the Spider-Man lore, Uncle Ben's death is the major catalyst for Spider-Man developing into the hero he becomes. So you think that that's something that happens so early on so that we can focus even more on Spider-Man. But here, this is literally 45 minutes into the movie, and it's a 2-hour movie, so it's almost halfway through, which is actually great they dedicated that much time to that early part of Peter's life, so that it makes the moment feel even more tragic, and it gives Peter so much character development. And it doesn't ruin the pacing at all, as this doesn't feel slow in the lead up to this scene. This film does an excellent job at balancing out a cool, action-packed superhero movie full of special effects and explosive stunts, along with being a tense, emotionally compelling character drama. The scenes of Peter are just as intriguing as the scenes of Spider-Man. So while it takes 45 minutes for Peter to become more of a hero, the journey to get there is still as engaging as we're watching him grow as a person while he also gets comfortable with his newfound powers. Which, by the way, the scene where he's figuring out what his powers are is always just so much fun to watch.
Go! Go! Go, Web, go!
And that leads to Tobey Maguire himself, and I thought he was excellent. He might not necessarily be the best Spider-Man in terms of the quippy personality that the character is usually known for when suited up.
Are you in or are you out?
It's you who's out, Gobby. Out of your mind.
Wrong answer!
But of all the cinematic versions of Peter Parker we've gotten so far, he's easily the best there is. Because he feels relatable. We can relate to his struggles of maybe not being the most popular kid in class, and we can relate to his desire of just wanting to be a better person, which is the thing that drives him forward the entire time. This entire film conveys a giant internal conflict he faces where he has to accept that great responsibility and follow the advice he didn't listen to from Uncle Ben. But he has to struggle with balancing that responsibility with sacrificing the things and people he loves. He can't let the girl of his dreams know the truth, and so he can't have a relationship with her. He can't hold down the job because he's always late, which we see even further in the second movie. He can't tell the truth to his aunt or his best friend, and he essentially can't have a normal life. Which goes for any superhero really, but the way it's done here is used to tie into deeper themes about the price of having to put others over yourself, and the cost that comes with taking on such a huge responsibility. And Maguire brings out that struggle and that pain perfectly, and it makes him such a nuanced, relatable character that we enjoy following, and it more than made up for the fact that maybe he didn't have the funniest one-liners as Spider-Man himself. And honestly, because of how well Maguire, as well as the writing, captures Peter, and the way the film hones in on those themes about responsibility, that's always what made this movie, as well as the next one, connect as well as it does, because it's in tune to what makes Spider-Man such a compelling character. Not that I think a movie's only good if it does exactly what the source material material does, and I'm not going to turn this into a giant comparison video or anything, but there's an essence as to what makes this character as great as he is. He feels like a real person who goes through many of the same struggles that a lot of us have to go through, and it's those struggles that always move him forward. He just also happens to be bit by a radioactive spider and receive superpowers, but that's not ultimately what makes him as interesting of a character. It's the things he goes through as Peter that give him such a sense of timelessness, and why he's always stood out more than nearly any other comic book character, and that depiction and those struggles are captured wonderfully through Maguire's performance. Now, there have been some criticisms that he clearly looks a little too old for the role, mainly that he's too old to look like someone who graduated high school, and I gotta say, that's really not that big of a deal as far as I'm concerned. I mean, yeah, in hindsight, he looks noticeably a little older than your average high school student, but it's not that distracting, especially since he's only in high school for a small part of the movie. Plus, unless it looks that noticeable, like you're someone clearly middle-aged playing a high school student, that criticism about the age of the actor is one that I think is a bit silly. Considering I feel people will pick and choose which movies they want to evoke that criticism for. Like, in Grease, there were people literally in their 30s playing high school seniors, and I've never once heard a complaint about that film. Obviously, you want to go with casting that's as close to the age range as the characters they're playing, whether it be older actors playing someone younger, or a younger actor playing someone older, or whatever it is. But that's something that's been going on forever, and as long as you're doing a good job of making them believable at whatever age they're meant to be, and it doesn't look like that much of a distraction, the fact that they're a certain age shouldn't be the end of the world, at least where appropriate. But let's talk about someone who we can all agree is awesome, and that's Willem Dafoe as the Green Goblin. No matter what your opinion on the movie as a whole is, or the Green Goblin's suit, I think we can all agree Willem Dafoe's performance is hands down the best thing about this movie.
But you can't do this to me. I started this company.
You know how much I sacrificed?
For one thing, Norman Osborn just makes for a compelling villain. One thing that some superhero movies have been criticized for is that the villain is essentially just a copy and paste bad version of the hero. Like, they have the same powers, but they're just evil. Now, that's not necessarily the case for Osborn here, as the Green Goblin doesn't have any of the same powers as Spider-Man. However, what I liked is that their respective trajectories do have some similarities, and it's in those dramatic beats that lead them down to completely different paths, even if in one case it's one of the most extreme ways possible. Because Norman starts out as a good person, even if shown to not exactly have the greatest relationship with his son Harry.
Harry tells me you're quite the science whiz. You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
But like Peter, he's someone who is at risk of losing the things he values most, in which case it's the future of his company. Even though he's a successful businessman, he's at risk of losing funding for a huge project, and it causes him in desperation to do the irresponsible thing and take this serum that hasn't been proven to be safe, which leads to the Green Goblin personality emerging. And while Norman starts off going back and forth between his personality and the Goblin's, as he continues to be wronged and he gets angrier, the Goblin begins to consume him more and more until he lets him take over completely. So here you have someone who's in danger of losing it all, tries to do the irresponsible thing, and as a result, it costs him his sanity and eventually his life, making him the polar opposite of Peter without him having just be a copy and paste of Spider-Man, while still tying into the film's overall themes. And then of course, let's not forget the main reason why he's become such an iconic villain, and that's the fact that Willem Dafoe just chews up all the scenery.
Can Spider-Man come out to play? The itsy bitsy spider went up the water spout. Down came the goblin and took the spider out.
While he's someone who's been known for playing characters who can be a bit out there, this is the most extreme iteration of that, and I love every single minute of it. All the cackling, the puns, the snarky remarks, the one-liners, and the over-the-top way in which the Goblin torments and taunts people can't be beat.
Out am I? Impressive!
Deliver!
Finish it! Finish it!
A lot of those lines are just comedic gold, just for the way that Dafoe says it, and he clearly looks like he's having an absolute blast. And what's even more masterful is the way he seamlessly shifts in and out of the Norman personality and the Goblin personality, like most famously in the mirror scene.
You killed them.
We killed them.
And his performance fits perfectly with the tone this film's going for, which is a mix of melodrama and camp. And that's another thing that some people may be turned off by, at least those who are used to the state of superhero movies post-2008. Because after The Dark Knight and Iron Man, superhero movies feel like they ventured off in one of two different directions. You have your ultra-dark, gritty superhero movies, like what DC did with the Dark Knight trilogy and what they tried doing with the early days of the DCEU, and then you have the really quippy, mostly lighthearted, spectacle-based kind of superhero movies that you can still take seriously enough, which are pretty much most of what we get from the MCU. A style that I enjoy, by the way. But this was at a time where superhero movies weren't always seen as the most serious type of movie out there. The view was that comic books and superheroes were viewed as a little cheesy, and at one point they were, and I say that as someone who does read comic books. So because of that perspective, a lot of superhero movies at this time, even some of the more serious ones, have that air of cheesiness to them. Even the Tim Burton Batman movies, as much as I love those as well, even though they were known for being much more serious takes on Batman, there's still a bit of goofiness with some of the villains, like Jack Nicholson's Joker. So in that vein, this takes on a tone that fully embraces all that goofiness and cheesiness, which is something you will rarely ever see in a superhero movie again, even a lot of these MCU films. And to be fair, by today's standards, considering how mainstream superhero movies have become, something like this probably wouldn't work so much anymore. I'd say the closest we've got was Aquaman in 2018, which I know some people are mixed on, but I thoroughly enjoyed it personally. So this is something that, again, if you didn't grow up with these movies and you're coming back to them much later on, you might be a little turned off by the tone. But I think it works really well, mainly because the film, even though it does get serious, fully embraces and commits to its more ridiculous elements. And if there's anyone who can pull off cheesiness and campiness, it's Sam Raimi. Because while Raimi has a reputation for being one of the best horror directors of all time, he's also built his career off campy movies like Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, Crime Wave, Darkman. That over-the-top style seen here from time to time is right up his alley. And here he manages to channel that style into a mainstream blockbuster superhero movie, and he successfully pulls it off. And I will say, it leads to some moments that are admittedly a little corny, like maybe the way in which Peter fawns over Mary Jane is a bit silly, but it also leads to so many classic scenes, lines of dialogue, and action sequences, especially with the film's mixing of CGI with practical effects, like the scene in the burning building, the first Goblin attack, or really any of the Goblin scenes, and my personal favorite, the cage match.
Hey, Freak Show! You're going nowhere! I got you for 3 minutes! 3 minutes of playtime!
And as for those action scenes in general, every single one of them feels 100% memorable. Again, I know by today's standards they can feel a little dated, but the nice use of practical effects mixed in with the then groundbreaking digital effects gives this film a sense of authenticity that can sometimes feel lost with films that go a little too heavy on the digital effects. Each of the action scenes here was spectacularly done, as they felt like they had a strong emotional impact while still having a sense of fun, especially due to all the great Goblin one-liners thrown in there. And then there's J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. This is the other bit of casting that is just spot on, and when it comes to characters who make such a huge impact in such a short amount of screen time, this one is close to the top, which is surprising when you think about it, because he's only in a handful of scenes that don't go on for too long. But you don't fully realize it, because he has so many memorable lines that you think, well, surely there's something that I just missed in between all those great moments. But no, literally every word out of this guy's mouth is some of the best stuff.
They're crap. 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 Mega crap. I'll give you $200 for all of them.
Just because he does such a fantastic job of playing a blustering, loudmouth windbag who has this massive vendetta against Spider-Man, which is partially because he actually believes it, and partially so he can conjure up newspaper headlines he knows will draw people in.
Put an ad on the front page. Cash money for a picture of Spider-Man. He doesn't want to be famous, and I'll make him infamous.
The one thing worth noting on this most recent rewatch is, as antagonistic as this guy is, you realize he's actually not a bad person, considering he could have easily sold out Peter when the Goblin bursts into the Daily Bugle and tries to find out who takes pictures of Spider-Man. He not only says no once, but he then doubles down on it when the Goblin sees through him.
Who's the photographer who takes the pictures of Spider-Man?
I don't know who he is. His stuff comes in the mail. You're lying! I swear.
And he does it for someone he only just met, which I think, for all of his grumbling and hollering, makes him a much better person than he's given credit for. And Simmons plays the role to perfection, and was easily one of the best casting choices in this. So much that, of course, he even came back as the MCU version of the character, which I was happy about because I honestly can't think of anyone else better to play the character. And I also do want to bring up Kirsten Dunst, who I feel doesn't get enough credit for her work in these films. Now, she can definitely feel like that damsel in distress, where once Peter suits up, a lot of their interactions involve him saving her from getting mugged or attacked, but I do feel she has a compelling arc of her own. It's not necessarily as defined as Peter's, but it's there, and it's one that gets explored in all three movies. We see her desperately trying to escape a bad home life and try to follow her own dreams of becoming an actress, and she tries to have some sense of stability in her life, and we see that in those great little interactions with her and Peter in their backyards, and when he runs into her leaving her waitressing job. They're small moments, and like I said, the way Peter fawns over her does lead to some corny dialogue.
You're taller than you look.
I hunch.
Don't.
But as corny as they can be, there's nothing I'd say that's really cringeworthy thrown in there. Even if it's not the most spectacular dialogue, it still feels nice for the most part. And any faults are made up for by Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst's wonderful chemistry with one another. And it makes any imperfections in what they say pretty forgivable. Spider-Man certainly has elements that are a product of its time, and those who didn't grow up on the film may not quite love it the way those who saw it at the time of its release did. But for me, I still find it to be an absolute blast from start to finish. Not only does it capture the very essence of what makes Spider-Man a compelling character, always making sure to circle back to its strong themes, but it's so much fun, from the memorable action scenes, corny one-liners, and a bunch of scene-stealing performances, mainly from Willem, Dafoe, and J.K. Simmons. But at the center of it all is a great lead performance by Tobey Maguire, who gives us what's still the best cinematic version of Peter Parker to this day. It's one of the greatest superhero movies of all time, and one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's one that never fails to put a smile on my face. Spider-Man gets a 10 out of 10. I understand the fault that some people have with it, especially those that didn't grow up on the movie, but for me, they're just nitpicks. I'm not bothered by them so much. I think every single thing about this that's strong works so well that it makes up for the few faults the film does have. And honestly, no movie is truly perfect, so of course there's always going to be something to pick on. But still, this is just one of my all-time favorites, and I get a kick out of it every single time. But stay tuned, as up next will be my review of the sequel, Spider-Man 2. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see Spider-Man, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you see it when it was first released, or did you not get around to it till years later? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.